Okay, well, welcome everyone to our meeting of the White Allies Network this evening. Whether or not you've been here many times before, or this is your first time, you are very welcome indeed. If you want to just put in the chat where you're joining us from, because we do have people from a number of different countries often joining us, so that would be lovely for others to see where people are joining them from as well. That'd be great. Thank you. So our topic this evening is decolonisation, and it's I think part one of a series we're probably going to run over a number of years because this is a big topic. And we want to start today with understanding colonisation. I'm delighted that Neil, one of our Council of Reference in the White Allies Network, has agreed to kind of host a conversation around this topic this evening. Really appreciate that, particularly as he has suffered a close family bereavement recently. And so I really do appreciate you being able to make this, Neil, and helping us with this. Just to give you an overview of what our agenda is for this evening, going to remind everyone of our purpose, useful particularly if you're here for the first time, what our purpose is as a network, but also some of the qualities of our spaces that we try and maintain. In a sense, it's like ground rules that we ask everyone to agree to so that we can have the best possible kind of conversation. So we'll just recap on those. I usually do a bit of an update on race and racism in the news as far as the things that I've spotted since we last met, so I shall share a little bit of that as well. And then we'll get into our main topic. We've got a video to show you to start with, which lasts 20 minutes. And then Neil's going to pick up the conversation from there and just bring in some more facts as well as summarizing some of the main issues that are shared in the video. We will probably actually stay as a whole group for discussion this time, because I think up to that point, we may be running a little bit tight for time at the end. So we might just keep it open and just share our thoughts based on 3 questions that we'd like to share with you. Then I'd like to share what's next on the agenda in terms of our meetings. And if you can stick around beyond 9:30 for 15, 20 minutes, we will stop the recording at that stage. And it's just quite nice to catch up and continue a conversation for those that can stick around. And it's been lovely that so many have stayed around for a further conversation after our 9:30 cut-off time. So that's the agenda. So a reminder of our aims as a network. We aim to help become true allies of people of colour in the fight against racial injustice. That means learning about ourselves as white people, our histories, our privileges and our impacts, but also to learn about people of colour, their histories, their experiences and their perspectives as well. We really want to take that forward though into action. So this isn't just a talking shop, but we want to develop ideas for action that we can take individually, collectively, and in partnership with others towards racial justice. And just to emphasize that everyone is welcome at our meetings, both aspiring white allies and co-mentors, people of colour that can journey with us. We call ourselves white allies because we want to be seen as white people stepping up and as Layla Saad said, I think, do the work of taking responsibility for challenging racism, not as white saviors, but very much as allies and partners with those that experience racism on a day-to-day basis. So that's our aims. The qualities of our spaces are summarized in these pairs of qualities, actually. We want everyone, if you can, to be respectful and non-judgmental, being slow to make negative judgments of each other. If someone else shares something that you think is offensive, just be slow to make that negative judgment and be curious. We'll come to that next. Being aware of intersectionality of experiences too is really important. Yes, being humble and curious about each other's views, but also able to own our own ignorance, and if we unintentionally offend, to say sorry authentically as well. It's an emotive subject, one that often triggers us in different ways, and just pausing before responding if we do feel triggered is probably a wise response. We need to be mindful and heartful, careful, thinking before we speak, considerate in our contributions and our language. But it's an emotional topic, and it's okay to be emotional about this, as well as empathetic to other people's emotions. We don't want to rationalize away each other's feelings, but able to just be with them in those, as well as being able to express our own feelings too. And finally, open and authentic, personal, able to speak our own truth, sharing our own experiences and perspectives, and having that respected by others. But also courageous, open to challenge and to be challenged, having the courage to confront ourselves and others. And certainly I am constantly aware of how much I need to confront myself, aware of something being triggered in me and something, a stereotype perhaps, or a potentially racist attitude that I hadn't spotted before. I need to be owning that and be courageous to challenge that in myself as well. But it's really important that it's confidential. If we break into small groups and people share something, or people just share something which is very personal, to keep that to the space in which it is shared. And if during our conversations that you say something you prefer not to be on the recording later, then please let me know, and I will make sure that is deleted at the time. We also, just lastly, to be kind and other-centered, sensitive to each other's needs, building relationships first. Knowing that some people need more time and space than others to express their views, but also to be able to make a contribution. We don't want to wallow in white guilt. We want to recognize that becoming anti-racist is not about me, but it's not about defending our own egos, but it's about serving a greater cause. So those are the qualities of our spaces. I do hope you can sign up to those. If you have a major problem with any of those, then there might be something else on TV worth watching, rather than being in this space. But we do ask you to commit to those, and we assume as we continue that you're able to do so. By the way, a full list of these qualities are on our website. Actually quite good qualities for life in general, aren't they? Not just for this particular network context. But moving on, race and racism in the news. This is just a few things that have really struck me since our last meeting in October. One thing which is such a tragedy, wasn't it, to lose Benjamin Zephaniah, one of my personal heroes, and just how he managed to combine his poetry and his challenge with a real kind spirit. I don't know, he had a rare gift really to be able to challenge us, but really challenge us without feeling it was coming from a place of hatred or a negative place, but a place in which we needed to connect with him on really. So I think probably many of you will join me in really mourning his loss at the young age of 65. And then there was the Harvard president, Claudine Gay, the first Black president of such a prestigious university, that seemed to be really the victim of a relentless campaign from some of the Republican senators there. If you want to see more of this story, then I think James is going to post a link into the chat. And by the way, I'm going to post a few links into the chat. If you want to just copy and paste them onto another document, you might find that helpful. But James, yeah, I can just see that James has posted that in there. So rather than look at it now and just distract yourself, if you can copy and paste that into a document, that's well worth watching. What that particular report on this campaign, which made her position really untenable at Harvard, unfortunately, having only been in the position 6 months. And then there was obviously the post office scandal has hit us here in the UK, and what was described as one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in the UK's history. The way that so many postmasters and mistresses were convicted of crimes they hadn't done because of software failures in the system, being accused of stealing from their funds. And I think a number of us just reflected on how much attention that got in Parliament compared with the Windrush scandal, in which people that had served our nation here in the UK and served the Allies during the war were deported as if they were never citizens because of a Home Office debacle, really, of identity papers and citizenship. And that is still going on. And there is, I think James is going to post a couple of other links in there. There's a really good interview. Annie Lennox, the musician, and a number of actors have got on the campaign. And I really would encourage you, if you can, if you haven't put your name to it so far, the Justice for Windrush campaign, please put your name to that. And if you're in the UK, write to your MP around that too, because we really do need to make sure this doesn't just fade into the background. There's such an injustice done by the government itself here, which needs to continue to be addressed. Lots of bad news at the moment, isn't there? And to talk about bad news, the Rwanda partnership has also been prominent in the news here in the UK of trying to export the challenge of migration, and not just migration, asylum seekers having their claims processed in Rwanda rather than the UK, to try and put the traffickers or the people that organise the boats from sending them across. So that's something that is really quite controversial here in the UK right now. And then, of course, the situation in Israel-Palestine. I was just struck how quickly after the massacre of Israelis, how anti-Semitism just seemed to have a new wave across the UK and across other countries, even before the Israelis retaliated. And then since then, what seems to have just developed into a relentless genocide of the Palestinian people is just absolutely horrendous. That's enough bad news, isn't there? I just want to put one bit of good news. I say it's good news. It's just something I would really like to celebrate. And that is the example of Lord Simon Woolley. This is not news as such. He's been principal at Homerton College probably now for a year and a half, maybe 2 years at Cambridge University, but it really is opening up the college and the university to help young Black potential students to see, actually, maybe I could belong here, maybe I could study here. And I follow him on LinkedIn. I recommend that you do as well, because he's doing such good work there at Homerton College. Well worth following him if you can. All right, that's enough from the news at the moment. Just a quick reminder of what we did last time. Reparations was our focus. We had Professor Robert Beckford, who's been a documentary maker on this topic, as well as people from Heirs of Slavery, Alex Renton and John Dow, two of the founder members, talking about reparations and what they are doing in response to the call for reparations across the globe. And Suzanne was there to help field questions too. That is all recorded. That is all on the YouTube channel, which you can get via the website. So do tap into that. That was such a rich conversation we had with the panel after that on that subject. What I'm going to share with you is a 20-minute video. And it really covers some of the basics of what colonisation is. And we felt that was a useful starting point before we look at decolonisation. Neil's going to talk to that as well once the video is over. At this point in our meeting, we viewed a 20-minute online video from Andrewism that can be found here on his YouTube channel. We are unable to include it in this recording for copyright reasons, but we recommend you pause this recording and watch it now to gain the most benefit from what follows. Okay, that was quite a fast-moving video, wasn't it? Quite a lot packed into that. I'm going to left the subtitles up there because I thought it might help to use just to keep keeping track with that. But Neil's going to help us unpack that now. So yeah, Andrewism, as I said, as he said at the end, there comes from an anarchist perspective. If you're a baby boomer like me, the word anarchy can have such connotations of complete disintegration of law and order, this kind of stuff. And yet then I found out that Benjamin Zephaniah will call himself an anarchist as well. Maybe there's a different perspective of anarchy than I originally thought when I was growing up. But certainly I thought that was a pretty balanced introduction actually to the topic. So, but I'm going to let Neil take over now, and I'm going to see whether I can do your slides for you, as we had a few problems before, didn't we? So, but Neil, would you like to unmute and over to you at this stage?
Good evening, everyone. And Yeah, I think that video really encapsulates a lot of the thoughts that I'm just gonna try and get through quite a number of slides. So forgive me if I if a lot of the information is sounds similar, but I would really like to kind of focus on some of the present day situations, which I believe is part of the legacy of colonialism. And so hopefully Adrian can bring up the slides. And I do want to, towards the end, have a chance that we can have an open discussion, questions and answers. So feel free to write down any questions or comments that you might have. And then hopefully towards the end, we can explore that together. So here, hopefully you can see a screen with a map. And this map represents all the colonies, the former British colonies, and then the year of their independence. And as you can see, it spans many continents, several continents, and many, many countries. So the reach of British colonialism was quite expansive, as the video kind of plays out. For me, what was a really good summary in the video that we just watched that came across to me was when the presenter mentioned how colonialism has introduced enduring systems and institutions that scar social, political, and economic landscape of independent colonies. Now, this really kind of brings home the fact of what the decolonization is all about. It seeks to deconstruct and reconstruct those enduring systems and institutions that continue, I'd argue, to scar the social, political, and economic landscapes of former colonies. And so, as the presenter mentioned in the video, these systems, these institutions were not built for the benefit of the colonized, they were built for the benefit of the colonizers. So I wanted to touch on the three areas that were mentioned in the video, where he mentions about acts of enclosure, acts of possession, and acts of administration. And these are kind of the three methods that colonialism used to exercise their power over other regions around the world. And I wanted to touch, if you can go forward for me, Adrian, on each one of those three different acts and how they play out in our current world, in our current present time. And I really wanted to kind of hone it, or kind of bring examples of that around the world that we can look at. So in regards to acts of enclosure, it's all about the dispossession of land from indigenous people. And it's interesting that in 2017, so not that long ago, there was a land audit done in South Africa where they discovered that actually 72% of private farm land were owned by white South Africans, despite white South Africans only representing just 9% of the total population of South Africa. 72% held by 9% of the population. Now, I don't know about you, but those figures kind of reveal a huge racial disparity to me. And it kind of indicates the kind of white-black colonial economic divide that still remains to this day. So this is not hundreds of years ago. This is 2017. Before I do, I just wanted to touch on one thing that we can go back to. That some may be aware, or you may not be aware, that in 1913, under colonial rule, there was something that was exercised called the Native Land Act. And this saw thousands of Black families forcibly removed from their land in Africa, in South Africa particularly. And they were also, Black people, restricted from directly buying or occupying African land. And so we know that in the Land Act, that same Land Act was repealed finally in 1991. But I want you to think for just a moment that within those 26 years between 1991, when it was repealed, the Land Act, and 2017, when this land audit was done, I wonder if you can think that 26 years can make up for over 78 years of racially biased land and wealth acquisition in South Africa. I don't think it can. And that's why we still have this economic divide still in South Africa. today. And there's a saying about decolonialization remains incomplete if the land does not return to its rightful owners. And I believe what a form of decolonization is about reclaiming the land that was previously taken from others. So acts of possession is all about claiming or renaming indigenous territories or names, claiming their names. And so colonizers would come in and they would change names. Like, for instance, Rhodesia was a name given to the African piece of land that we now know as Zambia and Zimbabwe. And also names were taken on board by colonializers. And I just wanted to give a modern day demonstration or example of that. Now, this may seem very harmless, but in America, if you are aware of the American football, the NFL, there was a team called the Washington Redskins. And the Native Americans had been saying for years upon years upon years that they considered this a racial slur for their own ancestors, for their own people. And they protested again and again and again because they felt like it was a cultural appropriation and actually a very negative way of viewing their ancestry and their history and their heritage. And it was only in 2022 when it was actually the sports team actually gave in and actually changed their name from Washington Redskins to Washington Commanders. So they no longer called Redskins. And so for me, again, this is a kind of a demonstration of how people are seeking to decolonize themselves from, to change certain institutions, change certain ways of thinking in the public consciousness, to remind them that actually these things do impact people still to this day. And in regards to acts of administration, this is how the colonial powers manage their territories, economically, politically, and socially. And we go to the next slide. I want to show an example of how this plays out in today, in our current time. So some of you might be aware that actually in 14 different African countries, they are still tied into what's called the CFA franc currencies. So these were former French colonies, and they became independent, but even after their independence, they still are financially, economically tied to the franc-backed currencies. And this causes major problems for them to this day. And I'm going to show, the next slide is an article that was written. It's quite a strongly worded article, but I think it gets the point across. And I'm going to just read it. Forgive me for reading this to you. But the West has been for centuries and remains to this day the most destructive outside factor and the strongest force against swift independent development and deepening of democracy on the continent. Indeed, the remnants of West's abusive colonial arrangements are still crippling African states politically and economically. For example, 14 African countries, including Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, still use the neocolonial SFA franc, which is guaranteed by France and pegged to euro as its currency. In return, France requires these countries to keep 50% of their foreign exchange reserves with the French treasury. This adverse and costly financial entanglement has allowed Paris to exercise undue and outsized influence over CFA franc countries' economic and political affairs. As a result, most of these countries have struggled to flourish in the post-colonial era. And again, this just really drives home the fact that actually this is still having an impact. These colonial kind of legacies, these ways of kind of setting systems in place economically are still having an effect on a lot of these African countries today. And many of these 14 countries that I just showed you in the map are seeking to decolonize themselves from these economic systems. And I just want to emphasize that this is not just an African issue, that there are many other countries in the world that are affected by Western economic institutions. And I want to highlight the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, who were originally, some of you will know, were originally set up to provide financial development and assistance to developing countries. And some of the members that were part of that included China, India, Sri Lanka, many other Asian and South Asian countries. But it's interesting to note in the next slide what this author says. And this is a book that just came out last year. Somebody who actually looked at the policies of the IMF, and he wrote in his book the following: the World Bank and IMF's development and assistance has been anything but development and assistance. Their loans and structural adjustment policies have plunged poor countries into impossibly large debt traps and forced developing countries to focus on producing goods for consumption in the West instead of growing consumption and industry at home. The reality, in his estimation, is a history of neo-colonial exploitation with shocking results. And I think that's a very damning statement in regards to the IMF and the World Bank. And his voice is not alone. In speaking of the IMF and the World Bank, these two gentlemen at the bottom, the one on the left is an economic anthropologist, a professor, and he's looked at these institutions for a very long time. And his conclusion is actually that these institutions, in his opinion, are designed with colonial principles in mind and remain largely colonial in character to this day. It's his opinion. And then the second person on the right-hand side is also a very highly acclaimed professor of economics in America. His name is Michael Hudson. And his opinion is that the most evil organizations in the world today, in his opinion, are the World Bank and the IMF. He's on record as saying that just last year in an open debate. And so these are guys who are not flaky individuals. They are seasoned veterans of how economies and systems and institutions work. And even their conclusion is actually they're very, very negative towards IMF and the World Bank. Some will know this, but as of 2021, the countries that owe the most debt to the World Bank are actually India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. See the rest of them there. I won't go through them all. So it creates a huge amount of debt in countries that are seeking to develop themselves. And so that's why there's a desperate desire among many countries around the world for economic decolonization. And that's why we see the rise of what we know as the BRICS. Some of you may be aware of what those countries are coming together, like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Egypt and Ethiopia, Iran, and United Arab Emirates. And they're seeking to try and create another economic system outside of the IMF and the World Bank, because they realize the effects, the negative effects that these other institutions have had on them over years. And so there is a desire to break free from the colonial ties of the IMF and the World Bank because it builds such debt traps for them. So at this point, I want to kind of shift a little bit. Rather than talking just about the politics or the economics, I want to touch on the psychological effects that colonialism has had on people down through the centuries. This is a great quote, I think, from the actress Lupita Nyong'o, who says, what colonialism does is cause an identity crisis about one's own culture. And I totally agree with this perspective. I think that what colonialism and neo-colonialism does is create what I call a condescending narrative. I think it inherently sees other countries and other cultures as being somehow morally or culturally deficit, and hence the need for others to be civilized or through colonial or neo-colonial means. In other words, this narrative of the West knows best, and that they come in to fix everything. And I think there's an underlying narrative as well there about that if poor countries remain poor, then it must be their fault. It must be something internally wrong with those countries, which is why the West needs to come in and solve the problem. And I think that is a legacy of some of these attitudes that existed under colonialism. And I think, sadly, many of these former colonies and individuals that lived there, some of us begin to question our own ability, our own agency, our own, even our own culture, in the light of the West knows best. And I think these kind of attitudes and perceptions have long-lasting psychological effects, not just on the descendants of those who are colonized, but also on the descendants of those who were the colonizers. I think it has an effect on both sides of the spectrum. And I think our perceptions, even today, of other countries and cultures and people are affected by these deep underlying narratives. And I would say this plays out in our politics today. If you watch the TV as much as I do, you'll hear politicians all around the world, even in the UK, when they talk about foreigners or immigrants, it can be quite negative. When the European politicians talk about foreigners, immigrants, or others, it can be quite negative. And if you hear the American politicians speak, their rhetoric about foreigners and immigrants and others can be quite negative. And I think that's a legacy of this psychological holding on to this narrative about others. And I believe that we need a psychological decolonization, a decolonization of the mind. As the late great psychiatrist and political philosopher once said, Francis Fanon, he said, imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which must be clinically detected and removed from our land, but from our minds as well. It should be removed from our minds as well. So we do need that. I love this quote from an Aboriginal Canadian Inuit who said that not only are Indigenous people forced to shoulder the burden of colonialism, we are expected to celebrate it. And there's this really weird tension between those who have felt the harms of colonialism down through the centuries, that there's an expectation for the same people to celebrate aspects of the legacy of colonialism. So, for example, if we go to our next slide, we'll see a modern day example of this. In 2022, you will see how William and Kate did a Caribbean tour, and they went to Jamaica, and there was an expectation that they would be celebrated, that they would be honored, that they would be respected. But as we know, that many people actually came out in protest of their visitation. And actually, as some of you may know, this year, 2024, Jamaica has scheduled a referendum to see whether they are willing to cut ties completely with the British monarchy for once and for all. And I think that this is the sentiment of many people in the Caribbean at the moment. And it's, again, a form of decolonization, removing oneself from these institutions that sadly have quite a bitter taste to many people. And I'm coming into land here now with this really powerful quote from Jasleen Sethi, who's a British-born woman, but from an Indian heritage. And she worked several years in Africa and also in the Southeast. And I'm about to read a very powerful statement that she made online. And I think it really summarizes a lot of what I'm trying to get across and what the video I think tried to get across. She says, notice when you talk to your black and brown and non-white friends, they might be struggling to talk about Palestine in the same way that we might talk about other political issues. It is because we are in pain. It is because what's happening has reminded all of us that everything we've been taught about equality and justice for all of it is a lie. We aren't equally human in the eyes of people that rule us. We never were. In the UK, we grow up with the myth that there was some acknowledgement of the crimes of colonialism in the world, some repentance, but the state and power structures around us cannot possibly have any shame for the crimes of the past when they continue to commit them in the present day in real time. She continues to say, what is happening in Palestine has opened up generational colonial wounds. Colonialism ripped our parents' and grandparents' worlds apart, and we grew up with the scars. Colonialism never ended. And again, I think that's such a powerful statement to make. And for me, it just reminds me and many others, when we see things that's going on in Gaza, for instance, and in Israel, we see that these past and present generational wounds, the colonial wounds, are driving many people into the need to decolonize themselves from those who are still, in many ways, whether it's economically, military, are still oppressing them in many different ways. And I believe the people of Gaza are crying out for physical decolonialization at this moment in time as well. And my last slide, second to last. And so there is this growing movement to have decolonisation, and it really is about seeking change, not just tokenistic change, but actually real systemic change. It's about challenging existing power structures and institutions, including even the British monarchy, dare I say it out loud. And it's about highlighting and appreciating the voices of the oppressed, the voices of the marginalized, the voices of the exploited. So I want to close with this, which I think, Adrian, you touched on a little bit, with the Justice for Windrush scandal. And again, this is another legacy of colonialism that's come down through the ages and is still present with us today. And on his website, Justice for Windrush, Colin McFarlane said the following: sadly, we live in a world of racial bias which makes education on topics like slavery and colonialism all the more important from young to old. Growing up in the colony, my father was taught these subjects at school in Jamaica as part of the English curriculum. Yet when he arrived here at 20 years of age in 1955, he was shocked that those subjects weren't taught here in the UK, where it all began. And astonishingly, they are still not part of the school curriculum in 2023, and I would say 2024 as well. And this for me is the key, this last line here. If you don't know the history, you don't see the injustice. And for me, that really solidifies everything that I've been trying to say. I think decolonialization is all about exposing unknown histories and seeking to redress the unseen justice, whether that's within education or corporations, business, whether that's in the law, the policies that we have, whether that's in policing, the criminal justice system, whether that's in politics, whether that's in national or international economics. I truly believe that if we don't know the history, then we won't see the injustice. And I think I'll end with this. I think that there's much debate happening in the public square about what wokery is all about, because some people are concerned that when we talk about these things openly, that it's just a bunch of brown and black people complaining again. And I would suggest to you that actually what we're seeking to do is to retell the history so that people can begin to see the injustice that's happened over the centuries. So I'll end there.
Neil, thank you so much. As you've done before, you've really brought the topic to life and added so much more data for us to consider, and helping us to, well, just to bring to our minds the history that you've talked about, which is the starting point, which is something we've tried to do throughout our meetings, really, isn't it, to become more aware of our history. But thank you so much for the richness of what you shared there. So what we propose to do now for about 20 minutes or so is just to keep as a large group, actually, rather than going to small groups, because yeah, it gives a little bit more time for conversation, I think. Here we've got 3 questions that we want to work through, and let's just tackle one of them at a time, but I'll give you all 3 of them to start with so you know what's coming. So first of all, the first question is going to be from what Neil has shared or the video, what insight has stood out for you the most? So that's what we're going to look at first. Secondly, was there anything that was either difficult to understand in the video or what Neil shared, or that you find difficult to agree with? Okay, so that's something that you're struggling with a bit, is grappling with. And thirdly, we want to really nail it down as to, as allies, what can we do to further support the movement of decolonisation? Okay, so that's our direction of channel. If you want to feel free to unmute, or if you want to put it in the chat, I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. And if you prefer me to speak out your thoughts or your question, then I'm happy to do that as well. So for the first question then, anyone like to share what insights stood out for them the most from what you've heard this evening?
Did I offer something, Adrian?
Yeah, go for it, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, it was really powerful, and I've been, as you know, Adrian, I've been involved in stuff like this for about 35 years, and I've never ceased to be amazed at how powerful things like this can be. Now, my reflection actually was the bit that I just thought it made me remember when Neil was showing about South Africa and the land that's still owned, and what Mandela did was to sacrifice the economic power for the political power, and that's otherwise it would have been a bloodbath, and so that's why 71%'s left, in my opinion. But Mugabe in next door Zimbabwe spent decades taking the land back off the white farmers. So unfortunately, he didn't really redistribute it to the common people. He just added to his billions in Swiss bank accounts. And I suppose that's the problem that I could see that has happened, which is that, the sort of the sad part is that ordinary indigenous people have not had a chance through things like that, as well as all the history and it's unfortunate that there's quite a lot of examples of it, and it's just they're propped up by West keeping them that way as well. So I don't know what Neil thinks of what I just said, but it's just I find it sad that that's another consequence of it all.
Yeah, I agree with you, Neil, and great name, by the way. Yeah, I think that sadly you're right. I think there are and there are many people who have written about this. I would suggest I've got a number of resources I could suggest that you could maybe tap into, but there's one particular book that I had to stop reading because it was so difficult to read. Not difficult technically, but just the contents of it was really hard to read. And it's called White Malice, and it's by a historian named Sarah Williams, I believe. American historian, and she goes into great detail explaining how many of the leaders in particularly in African countries, those who really wanted to see great redistribution of wealth to empower ordinary people on the ground from the grassroots up, those leaders were actually assassinated, removed, kind of taken out of the equation. And I mean that in a both literal sense and a metaphorical sense, because external actors, and this may sound a little bit conspiratorial, but she writes with such weight and evidence, and she goes into it in forensic detail, how agencies like the CIA and the MI6, even in the UK, were involved in removing such leaders in Africa because it did not benefit them. And they would instead install leaders who were not very helpful to the vast majority of the people on the ground. And that's been the case for decades. There's this symbiotic, relationship between the West and what they would like from the countries that, in Africa and across the world. And they work to install people that are going to be beneficial to them.
Thanks, Neil. I would open up to anybody else like to share any of their insights or thoughts. So Jess has mentioned in the chat the economic institutions and structures were something that struck her. Angela.
Thank you, Neil, for an incredibly powerful presentation. One of the many things that struck me was the individual's psychological effect, and that fantastic quote about an identity crisis about one's own culture. Can you suggest any, as you've just suggested, the White Malice book, can you suggest any further reading, or shall I just look up the actress and go from there?
Yeah, I would point you in the direction of the following quote that I made from Francis Fanon, and
yes.
he done an amazing amount of books around this subject about the effects, the psychological effects that have impacted people of color from around the world. And again, they're not easy books to read, or not comfortable books to read. But I believe he was very, very articulate in expressing some of these psychological issues that are still within people today. There's another lady in America who's DeGrood, Dr. DeGrood. I can't remember. I'll find her.
Yes, Dr. Joy.
There you
Yes.
go. Thank you for helping me out. But yeah, she speaks about as a clinical, I think she's a clinical psychiatrist, fully trained, qualified, and she speaks, and she wrote her thesis on what she calls PTSD, which we all are familiar with that term, but she's actually spun it by calling it post-traumatic slave disorder.
Yes.
And she makes a very strong argument that whereas many other communities, when they've gone through a generational trauma, have had a chance to heal, has had a chance to reflect, has had a chance to get help, she makes the argument that actually that hasn't happened to a great degree with people who are descendants of slavery. And so there's lots of psychological issues
Thank you.
that I'm still dealing with.
And Angela and Neil, just to add,
Neil,
there's-
Neil, I just want to give as many other people a chance to talk as possible. Is
it was
that
just
all right?
adding something to what's just been
Okay,
said.
just
It's
briefly.
not a new point.
Okay.
It's Cheryl Grills. Cheryl Grills has done a lot of work as an African-American psychologist in all the same stuff that he's just been quoting. I just wanted to give people a reference point, that's all.
Thanks, Neil. Appreciate that. I've noticed that Jackie in the chat has asked for a list of the references because she didn't catch them all. I'm wondering whether we could send them out to the network afterwards. Is that the easiest way of doing it? It might be, mightn't it? If you are, and Jackie, you have signed up as a member, haven't you? So we can capture you in that one if that's okay. And unless, Neil, there's an easy way of just posting things into chat, but it probably isn't at the moment. But let's just why don't we move on to the second question, because time is moving on. Was there anything you struggled with that you were not sure you agree with, or that you're still struggling to understand in what was covered today?
Can I say something?
Yes, Ruth, do.
So yes, I also want to thank Neil for his presentation. But the bit that I can't remember who you were quoting, Neil, when you talked about the speed of change seems to have been slowed down, I think, by the economic manipulation of African countries. And I suppose what I was thinking connects to the idea that I think it's going to take ages to, you're talking about huge psychological change that has to almost, I don't know, come out from individuals into the whole country. It just feels like this process is going to take a very, very long time.
I tend to agree. I think we are talking about deep-seated issues here, so these things will take a level of time. I'm actually in the middle of training to become a psychotherapist. Everything that I'm learning about that field tells me that actually this process of change does take time. What I would say as a kind of a hopeful point is that actually I think over the past maybe 5 years, there's been a lot of people, as Neil mentioned, I do know that name, the lady that he mentioned, and there's others that are doing incredible work, not just in America, but in Africa and other places in the world, and trying to kind of grapple with these issues. So, but yeah, it's not an overnight transformation.
If I might interject a little bit,
Yes.
I think the thing that surprised me was the IMF and the World Bank. I don't think I was really as aware as with those points being highlighted, and yet all of a sudden it occurs to me that these are white institutions. They are ruled by white people, and they are built upon the institutions that have have generated, you know, trillions and trillions of dollars on the back of slavery and colonization. And that, you know, I'm sort of sitting here and go, why didn't I not think of that before? Well, you know, why have I never thought about that? I always thought that they were, you know, as you know, white people sometimes think that we're the good guys, right? You know, and all of a sudden you realize that, hey, you know, there's just another institution set up by white people to further the goals of what white people are. Dorothy was following a black female doctorate, and she had a big symbol, and it was a huge black circle, and in the middle of the black circle was this teeny white dot, and the white dot was the population of white people in the world. And it sort of went, whoa, okay, well, we are the minority as white people, yet we control the bulk of the money that runs around the world.
So really well put. And yeah, that's why the phrase is quite used more often these days about the global majority, as I like to think of that when even though I live in England, we're the global part of the global majority. But you're right. I think Jason Hickel, Professor Jason Hickel, who I referred to in my presentation, speaks of the disproportionality in the voting mechanisms as well in these institutions, exactly what you're suggesting. It's just amazing that we're the global majority, and yet the votes are so swayed in the opposite direction. The voices of the global majority in those same institutions are silenced or marginalized.
I mean, isn't the basis of this whole enterprise money? Isn't it all about greed,
Power?
and once you get that, then you want the power to control it and maintain it, and I suppose to expand on it, and all these other knock-on effects, like the psychological effect. Because when you're building trillions of dollars, who cares how people feel? I don't care. I want another $1 trillion. Let's do it.
Yeah, and power is difficult to let go.
Yeah. So then how do the African nations stand a chance to reestablish identity, to establish control, if somebody else in the world is controlling all the money? How do you begin to fight back?
Very good question. And I think a hint to part of the answer is what I was suggesting about the BRICS, this other it's almost circumventing. They're creating these other means to circumvent these lasting, institutions of the IMF and the World Bank. And I'm not suggesting that these are perfect, but it is a way forward to kind of begin to break the ties from these other institutions. So I think things like the BRICS and other unions that are coming up in Africa itself, but in other places in the world, gathering together, I think they're beginning to break free. It's going to be a long journey, though.
Yeah. It just Russia for me is but anyway, I understand kind of what you're trying to say. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Neil, very much.
I would agree with that last little comment. By the
So we're running close to the end of our scheduled time. We will, as I say, keep the channels open as we normally do. But I just wonder whether in the last few minutes, before I then talk about Irene, you want to speak?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm trying to be quick. Yeah, just becoming really aware of just my own lived experience. So, my mom, her family was from southern China. They left China, they escaped essentially and moved to northern Malaysia, where she was born. But because it was still a colony, so that enabled her to come over in the 60s to study nursing here. So I think, am I for, was that to her advantage? Well, in one level it was actually, but, and I don't know what her expectations were, you know, but she knew that it was a gateway to kind of supposedly a better life from a country that, well, that said it was welcoming and inviting people, its nations from around the world. But then, of course, she endured, you know, horrendous racism, you know, whether it was from staff nurses or whatever, or patients. And then I realized, you know, how much she had to change and alter her entire personality because her identities became not acceptable. The knock-on of that, it's influenced how she's raised her children, me, my older sister, and, you know, and then the knock-on effect on that of me. And I think of her now, she's 83, she's going to be 84 in March. And, you know, I notice, you know, what came up for me from the talk, from the presentation, or one of the things was how much she's had to kind of yo-yo between resignation, because she did choose to come here after all, and resentment because of how she's been treated when she only came here to kind of come and help, to work and study and play a part and everything. And I'm feeling lots of mixed emotions, which is quite common in these meetings, Adrian will know, you know, because it just it stirs things up on such a personal level. And you know, and I live in the consequences of that, you know, in terms of how I feel about myself, or how I've looked at the trajectory of my life, or how I've been projected onto and labeled, how I've labeled myself, projected onto myself, just everything. So I'm very much feeling in the present, you know, the manifestation of legacy of colonialism in my own, you know, really hitting hard tonight about in my family's own life. So
thank you for sharing that. I mean, that I really appreciate what you said there, and I think it really goes back to what the quote from the lady of Indian heritage, how
we
she
missed
felt
out my
that
community actually. She again used that phrase of like black and brown.
Yeah.
I understand. Yeah, I can understand that. I think the underlying message that she was trying to convey was that there's a lot of generational colonial wounds in many different communities. These things are so needed to be worked out and to be healed and to be redressed.
And I just want to say thank you for those of you in the room right now that do have experienced these things very deeply yourselves, and you're still willing to work with us and to journey with us on this. I do so appreciate that, because it's much more costly for you to be here in so many ways. So thank you. I want to keep the recording going for a little bit longer, if that's all right, even though we're coming up to the time, because I do want to tackle that last question, because we always want to bring it down to practicalities. What can we do? How can we be a part of a move for decolonisation ourselves? What can we do very practically? I don't know whether people have got any ideas that they're thinking already that they want to share, and also whether, Neil, you could bring out. I know you started to touch on that at the end of your presentation, but it'd be good if just a few of us could just share some thoughts on that. How can we make a difference? It seems so big, doesn't it? I mean, Ruth made the point really well. This is massive. It's going to take ages, and yet there's something for me in what Meg Weekly talks about in her books about how can we be at least an island of sanity in our own place. How can we just be that person of influence where we are, and hopefully those ripples will spread out around us, apart from anything else. But anyway, I'll stop talking. Ideas, practical application of some of this. Thoughts? Addison, yes, do you want to unmute and say something? Good to see you again.
Very obvious one. Read some of those books.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot tonight, and I've noted a lot of names. I thank Neil very much.
Thanks, Addison. Yeah, and you set an example for us in your 80s, still learning. Thank you so much. Fred, you have some thoughts.
Yes, I do. I mean, I'm like Alison, I'm a Quaker, and we're, as a society, we're trying to really get to grips with the question of reparations and what one can do. And I hate that word, incidentally. Redress is a better one. And huge wrongs have been done for centuries, and it's going to take centuries of work to help those we've wronged. I put a reference in the
Yes.
chat to a book called Reconsidering Reparations, which I found really worthwhile. It turned my thinking on its head, which was always good for me. But one of the things that came out of that really, really strongly was the idea that Bill was talking about, the way that the financial institutions and systems channel advantage towards the Western world. To those who have shall be given stuff, and disadvantage to others in black and brown friends and brothers and sisters.
And yellow. Brown and yellow. Yeah, great. Thanks, Fred. Any other thoughts? Shirley, thank you.
Thank you. Neil, massive thanks to all what you've shared and taken us through. I feel that as all of us get to learn more truthful data rather than misleading data, that we find our spaces and places to share that. I don't think people realize the amount of colonial tax that is still being paid into Europe from those countries, some of which that Neil has mentioned, and that the wealth of the places that we go to for our holidays and go, oh, isn't this an amazing city? Isn't this an amazing city? It is truly, they are amazing cities, but let's also recognize why they are so grand and where that money came from. And so that's a bit like also the story with the IMF and the World Bank. I remember saying to someone, you know, the World Bank just creates poverty, and they thought I'd said something dreadful. I was totally mistaken, and you know, how dare I? Because it's somehow an aid organization, and you kind of go, where did you get that from? But they give money to development countries, and I say, but do you know the interest that they charge? When the developing countries don't have the economy to make the money to pay back the basic rate rather than the interest as well as the basic rate. So there's just something about we will have our spaces and places to allow the truth to come out. And even if we say 5 or 6 things and our colleagues or our friends or our family remember 2 or 3 of those things, it's still shifting. So that's at a sort of a gentle movement side. And then I think in a more assertive movement, if we choose to participate in something like that, many of us will come from professional basis of whatever, you know, I don't know, economists, retailing, whatever it is our professional spaces are, to contribute to how those spaces might need to begin to decolonize, you know, be it models, frameworks, practices. I've just been working with some medical organizations and NHS, and I make a point of saying, do you know there are books around racism in medicine? Because they don't.
Thanks, Shirley. It's really, really helpful. I'm so conscious we could, well, can I just finish off a few things in terms of just notices at the end, and then I'll stop the recording, and then we can, those that can continue, then please do stick around and let's continue the conversation. But I just want to share just some news items, if you like, at the end, before I stop the recording. So just to make you aware, next time, the provisional dates and topics for the rest of 2024, this is what we have planned. Going to start a hidden racism series. We're calling it hidden. I mean, it's certainly not hidden to those on the receiving end of it, but it's hidden quite often from our eyes, from the media, certainly from white eyes, quite often. We're going to look at microaggressions, and again, it's a bit of a misnomer because if you're on the receiving end, it doesn't feel very micro. But let's explore what is meant by that, what things we might need to be much more aware of and act in that way. Second part of that, looking at racism against people groups that don't often make the news. We more often think of racism from a black perspective, to a certain extent from a brown perspective, but not so much from a yellow perspective. And so just bringing out some of the hidden racism that's there is an important part of what we want to do as well. Part 2 of decolonisation series will be decolonising the curriculum. This time we will hopefully get the black curriculum in. They had some sickness at the time when we tried a conversation with them in June, but hopefully we can get them back in October. So that's the plan for the rest of the year. And just to mention that all meetings will be on Zoom from 8 to 9:30. And Angela, would you mind just saying something about this event with Nova Reid? That'd be really good if you could.
Thank you, Adrian. Nova Reid runs in my opinion, fantastic anti-racism course. And tomorrow, 25th of January, between 7 and 8 p.m. online, is an open day. It's free. Anyone can come and find out about Nova's anti-racism course. It is directed at white people primarily, but if there's any black or brown or Asian or anyone not racialized as white who's interested, they are also exceedingly welcome. And Nova has a team who will take anyone who's not racialized as white through the psychological experience and the safety of doing the course. If anyone is interested who is not racialized as white, to email team@novareid.com. But otherwise, the open day is tomorrow, 7 to 8 p.m. Everybody is welcome. Existing students, including me, will be there to answer questions about the course, to talk about how we've struggled with it, how it has changed us, what we hope for in the future, how to move from shame and blame to curiosity and courage.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Angela. I know there's not much notice for you, but if you are available, that's going to be something well worth attending if you can. Unfortunately, I can't. I've got another commitment. So that will be very much worthwhile. Just to remind people too of our Padlet boards resources. We keep adding to these, lots of video links and article links that if you register on our website on our resources tab, these are fully accessible to you. They're links to resources rather than resources themselves. Actually, there are a few loaded on there, but most of them are links. So do take advantage of that. And also, we don't haven't charged for this event at all. If you would like to express your appreciation in some way, then we just invite you to donate towards the Cowrie Scholarship Foundation, just doing a great job there. And we've supported them in the past as well. So do consider that if you possibly can. And yes, that's about it from me there. So next meeting, 27th of March on microaggressions. Just to draw your attention to some of the resources that people have been putting in the chat there. It's been really helpful that you've been sharing some of the things, and thank you, Jackie, for sharing that divided racism medicine and why we need to decolonize healthcare that you mentioned there. That's really helpful. I'll see if I can get that on the Padlet board as well. But I'm going to stop recording there and stop sharing, and say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening.